And welcome Dave Nuckols.
Well, I really didn't relish following Yulon Kim when I heard his sermon, and then I realized I had to follow Greg Palmer, and now I have to follow these four guys, so that's tough. But before we go to lunch, we're going to just kind of map out the solution space. People I found are sort of confused. How did these three things come about that are coming out to the whole church within the next few days? And so I want to put them in context as well as give you a few details on the recommendation. So so I'm going to sort of map out visually where the various solutions fit. And you hear people talking about three. We had probably 9 or 10 things on the wall at one point. And with the benefit of hindsight, I realized we could sort of show them graphically on 2 dimensions. And the dimension that we have been on as church for the last 40 years is this dimension of I'm right and you're wrong. Right? There's going to be one correct opinion, and by golly, we're going to try to enforce that opinion so that everybody lives into what we have globally agreed. And so the little blue bubble on the right is our status quo, the current book of discipline, which has a single opinion, which is condemnatory towards LGBTQ persons. That is how it's received by that community, and it bans same-gender marriage and covenantal union, and it bars gay folks from being in the pulpit if they live into their full selves. That is our status quo single opinion. And currently, in this blue bubble, we enforce that inconsistently. In some parts of the church, those rules are ignored because they're not considered legitimate by the people in the churches in those areas and their mission field. In other parts of the church that are in conservative parts of this country, those rules are obeyed, and it's upsetting when other people are disobeying those rules. So that's where we are in blue. The bubble on the left in yellow is what the LGBTQ community has asked for. The gay community has asked for us to simply, as church, treat gay people the same as we treat straight people. To remove that condemnatory language, and let's just treat us the same. And the community there and their allies have not been asking that we then take that opinion and force everyone to obey, but that the church, through its policies, should treat everyone the same. But we have not been going around trying to convince conservative pastors that they need to do other things. That's been the simple proposition. That's in the yellow bubble. You could... I don't have the bills here. So those have been the 2 things that we were arguing about in 2016 and 2012, 2008 at General Conference. In 2016, some new proposals came up from the conservative side of the church in response to the fact that some people were disobeying those rules, and in response to the fact that some bishops were not enforcing those rules. The plan came forward to take that traditional plan and ramp up the enforcement to be sure we could really enforce it quite a bit. And that's still a current thought in the church. Some people would like to move us farther to the right in terms of enforcement. You could imagine on this continuum of one opinion that we enforce that there is an opposite side of that where progressive rules are in place and every pastor is expected to conform to that. That's not been a proposal from the progressive community, but you can imagine it exists there, and you'll see in a minute why I wanted to show it that way. So here's this axis of I'm right and you're wrong, and this is where we're stuck. Right? We've not been able to get through the impasse that has caused. So the bishops created a commission at the request of General Conference. We met for a year and a half, and we were given one particular clue by the bishops, this phrase contextual differentiation. And this was a way of finding something in the middle. Well, if there's only one opinion, right, one is left and one's right, there really isn't anything on that continuum that's truly in the middle. But they were asked us to consider a way to find a way to do different things in different places in a way that has integrity as best as we can, to live into this idea that we might have different opinions, different practices, and still be church together. And so contextual differentiation is hard to say, and it confuses people, and they wonder, is this congregationalism? And then we remember, oh yes, in different parts of the world, we alter the book of discipline. we have a global book of discipline that everyone votes on at General Conference, and that is the only book of discipline that we have on our shelf here in America. But in the central conferences and other parts of the world, they are allowed to adapt the book of discipline to their specific context, within certain limits. And in some places, they do that formally by voting on what the changes need to be to fit their context. In other places, they are much less legalistic than we tend to be, and they're just more flexible in what parts of the book of discipline they use and how they manage their interactions. So we have contextual differentiation on a global basis already today. And there are other things that we do that you might think of as contextual. For example, in ordination, we have minimum standards in the book of discipline, but every annual conference, their board of ordained ministry, they will read those standards, and they will also think about how does this apply in our context. If they feel like they need higher standards in some area, they can do that. So we have different standards in ordination on an annual conference basis to some extent. And when we talk about marriage, we know that some pastors feel strongly about remarriage after divorce, and other pastors are okay with that. And so from church to church, pastor to pastor, there's some differences even in terms of who can get married or how high is the bar of Christian counseling before marriage, for example. So this idea of contextual differentiation we already have, and now we're trying to think harder about how we apply it to the controversy that has brought us to an impasse. And so on the commission, we called that creating space. We heard Bishop Palmer talk about creating space so that we can live together more harmoniously. And it turns out space is this vertical dimension, and in one direction, space is creating space in between people who disagree. You can imagine our one big tent becomes a 3-room camping tent so that the disagreeing children can be in opposite rooms. That's this idea of a connectional conference model, or the multi-branch model that I show in the bottom. That's in the direction of structural space and separation. The other direction to create space is through increasing our ability to be compatible with one another. We're in this one-room tent. We don't have dividers between the rooms. How can we have more space in that one-room tent? Well, maybe we could take out of the tent the camping equipment that we left in the middle that we keep tripping over. And so on this issue, it's maybe some of these rules are causing conflict and trials and so forth. Maybe we could take those out of being in the tent that we inhabit together so that we feel like we have a little more space and breathing room in that one tent. That's the purpose of the one church plan. So, the one church plan, let me explain how that works. Here's a few details, and I'm going to say there are a lot more details than what's here. You will soon have the entire plan available to you. When you read the plan, please look at the petitions as well as the report if you're a delegate, because, the devil is in the detail, even in our book of discipline. You'll want to look at that, and you'll probably find when you look at the full report that there are some fears that you have not knowing all the details that will be dispelled. There'll be some things that you are worried about you won't see there. There probably will be some things in the plan that you had not yet imagined that will also irritate you. I mean, it's the nature of going down to the next level of details, but I think for our purpose today, this will suffice. The first thing to know is that in the One Church plan, we're basically making a theological statement that this controversy, the way we discriminate against practicing homosexuals, to use the language in our book of discipline, the way we discriminate, that question and that impasse that we have, that really should not be a church dividing question. That's what we're saying. And the way we say it is not to say, here's a right answer and here's a right answer, and I don't know what that means, but what we are going to say is that we know people have this view, and we have affirm them as people and as members of our church, and other people have another view, and we affirm them as members of our church. So we're living with all the folks that we love, even though there's disagreement on this question. The next thing to point out is that while this is going to allow changes in America, it doesn't have any change whatsoever in those central conferences where same-sex marriage is not even legal. Right? The first level of differentiation is if you're in a country that doesn't have same-sex marriage, you have that old book of discipline. You don't need to change it. And in America, it will be changing. The next thing I want to say is that the heart of this plan is to be mission-focused and to be able to be in full ministry to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer, non-binary persons. We are not in good ministry to that community today because of our stands and the way they're understood. This will help us to be missional with that community. And as it turns out, and I think you heard from the millennial discussion, that's not just about gay young people or gay older people. It's a lot of people in our society. And we'll kind of overgeneralize and say, well, especially the next generation. That's why I think I say here the restrictive language, the discriminatory language pushes away youth. Well, it's pushing away people that are my age. I'm old. So this change will open up so that we can be missionally focused where we are. Next thing to know is that this plan it assures freedom of conscience. No one is told you have to change your opinion. I think there was some discussion that Sinclair spoke to in terms of, well, some people are changing, and if we create an environment where people can be who they are, that might even include change too, and that's fine. But the purpose of the plan isn't to drive those changes, but just create the space where people can be who they are, believe what they believe, and we do that in part by taking away the prohibitions that are binding on our clergy persons today. Right? We take away those prohibitions, and we also ensure that there's non-interference. So in addition to taking away the prohibition, which you do the math and say, well, if the prohibition isn't there, that means I could do that if I want to. It's also very clear that district superintendents aren't supposed to tell their pastors, you have to do this or you can't do this. And it likewise tells the bishop that the bishops can't tell people what they have to do or what they can't do. And that directs the bishops and superintendents both on the managing clergy and local churches. So conscience is protected through this plan. What this basically means then is that we need to trust our leadership as we live into it, because the condemnation goes away. Affirmation of all people is there, but there is no specific new affirmation of same-sex marriage in this plan. The condemnation and the prohibition goes away. So what does that mean if it's neither affirmed or condemned as far as same-sex marriage goes? It just means we leave it up to the leaders. So for the Board of Ordained Ministry and the clergy session, they have the responsibility of adapting the standards to ministry. I mean, that's just how our polity works. They can address the question if they want to. They could have a vote of the clergy session. Lay people don't determine ordination, clergy people do. So the Board of Ordained Ministry could discern. They could bring it to the clergy session. The clergy session could take a vote, if they need to make a firm position one way or another for the clergy session of that annual conference. Or they could just figure out some other adaptive way of living into this over time. There's no immediate vote that's forced, but if they want to, they can have standards. And I'm sure that in America, there will be places where it'll be clear that gay folks are welcome to go through the ordination process, and that'll be really clear. There'll probably be some places that are clear that it's not, and there might be some places that are still figuring it out over a period of time. We're going to adaptively move into this new world. But that's a clergy decision. For marriage, that's up to the pastor. So no matter where you live in the United States, if you're a pastor, it is your decision to marry a same-gender couple or not to. Just like it's your decision to marry a couple where one party is divorced or not to. That's up to the pastor anywhere. Doesn't matter what the ordination standards are in your annual conference. This is a pastoral decision. And as far as lay people goes, there is one aspect of the plan that makes clear that before a same-gender wedding will happen in a church, the lay people of that church will have a say. There's no requirement that they take a vote by any given point in time, but if at some point in the future they would like to, they need to have done that vote. Some of our churches already have done that vote. And this is really there as an accommodation for conservative churches that feel like changes are happening quickly. Does this mean everything's going to happen to me at once? It's an accommodation that is there. So that's the one church plan. And let me kind of back up and just say, when the commission worked on possible plans, we needed to not just find a way we could build consensus, but we needed to bring the bishops along and have consensus that the bishops could support, and we needed to have something that had a chance of passing at General Conference. And so we felt like this was the best way of creating space and have the ability to pass it at General Conference. It's a significant effort to be able to pass it. We'll be talking about that some other point in the meeting, but remember, at General Conference, 60% of the delegates live in places where same-gender marriage is legal. 40% live in parts of the world where it's not legal. Many of those people live in places where just being a practicing homosexual is not legal. It wasn't that many years before that was the case in America, but America has changed dramatically. Some parts of the world haven't. Doing the math, out of those 60% who live in those places, we have quite a few conservative delegates from conservative parts of America. We don't have the votes just to do it within kind of an American framework. We need a global vote, so we need to figure out what can we do that opens up space here where we need space to be opened up, and yet still have enough international votes to get there. Those were the things we were wrestling with. So that's the one church plan. I'm trying to change the slide. Can the back help me just to change the slide? The clicker's not working. The Connectional conference model, this multi-branch model, people wonder, well, what are those branches like? This is what it's like. It assumes that there's a progressive branch, a centrist branch, and a traditional branch. Those would be created by constitutional amendments at General Conference if we were to go down this path. And it's envisioned that the centrist branch of this multi-branch model is exactly like what I just described for the one church model, where the condemnations go away, but we're still kind of trusting pastors to figure it out as they go. And the traditional branch of this multi-branch model would not be our current rules, but the stricter rules of this kind of farther to the right plan. That's what the traditional branch would look like. And the progressive branch would look like not just what the community has been asking for, but it really would assume every pastor who's in the progressive branch would be willing to do weddings. Opinions have changed over time, even with pastors. This kind of puts you in a box that makes it a little tricky if your opinions were to change, but that's what this plan does. One more slide. Just a few other things to say on this plan. The significant thing about separate branches is that we would ordain clergy within each branch. There'd still be annual conferences, but there would be no jurisdictional conference. But the annual conferences in the traditional branch would ordain clergy with their rules and standards, and the annual conference clergy in the progressive branch would do the same, following their standards, and the traditional branch would be like what I just described. And likewise with bishops, instead of electing at a jurisdictional level, we would have these three branches, and new bishops would be elected in their branch and follow their standards. What this means is there's going to be a significant, if this were to pass, a very significant sorting process in the church and a lot of votes to get through that. We heard a lot in the commission when we were listening to people that people don't like to have votes, and particularly don't want to have church votes. So, of course, here we have an option for the church that lets the jurisdiction vote where to be. Which of the three branches will this jurisdiction land in? Probably most of them would land in the middle, but they could land anywhere. And then annual conferences would then have a chance to agree or disagree with their jurisdiction, and an annual conference could leave its, if its jurisdiction chose to go into the conservative traditional branch, an annual conference could say, yeah, but we want to be in the progressive one, so we're going to vote to do that. These three branches will overlap the entire geography of America, and we'd remap that. But the annual conference would have a chance to have a really fun vote on that question. And, it turns out some local churches aren't a perfect fit for our, we know some local churches are not a fit for the current rules that we have today because people are disobeying. So this would let a church that maybe is a progressive church in an annual conference that's decided to land in the traditional branch, that church could have a vote and say, well, we're going to belong to the progressive branch, or maybe the center branch. So churches would vote, and of course bishops have to pick where they want to be, and clergy have to pick where they want to be, and we have to do a little bit of this. That's going to be a fun time. But we do have that sorting process to go through. How are we united through all that sorting? Well, we're still going to have a global council of bishops. Even though they're elected, with some different rules and standards, they would still be together to do some things. They would have a little bit less to do because there'll be more that they do at a branch level, if you will. Some of our agencies would be held in common. So Westpath, which does the pensions, and the General Council on Finance Administration, those would be shared. UMCOR, our relief agency, would be shared. Most or all of the General Board of Global Missions would be shared, but maybe some other agencies, every branch would decide how much do they want to participate. Because we learned in doing this process, and we were working on this plan because we knew some folks had threatened to leave if anything changes. We wanted to give them a place. Well, you can land here where the rules won't be changing. In that discussion with folks, we realized, well, yeah, but we've got other issues too, and if we're going to reimagine our connectionalism, we'd like not to have to support all of the agencies. So it's not spelled out in the plan which ones won't be. It says which ones will be, and it'll be up to the connectional conferences to decide, do they want to be in financially with General Board of Church and Society? Do they want to have something that looks like G-Corps or not? Do they want to be in financially with discipleship ministries? And as far as receiving pastors through ordination, do they like what GBHEM does, or do they want to pick a different set of seminaries? These would be some of the things that people have struggled with, and in the push and pull and coming up with this option, it was a little bit of, well, how much do we hold in common if we're creating separate spaces? And then, as you can imagine, the energy to implement it is quite large. This requires constitutional amendments. You'll need new books of discipline or the adaptable parts of new books of discipline for these branches. There would be some downsizing in some of the agencies, right? And maybe a new business model for some of them. There'd be a lot of energy on the part of our bishops and district superintendents to how do we keep people together once we've done this sorting? How, maintaining the level of unity that we would still have and managing the conflict of all that voting. And once your local church has voted, people who didn't agree in your local church might think, oh, this is a pretty important thing. I have to agree or not. There could be even more issues. This plan was the first thing we started with in the commission and was hard to let go. It's not our recommendation. And the reason why we spent so much time with it was because we knew some people are threatening to leave, and we wanted to create that space. You can see why we tried really hard. But even having done all that work, some of the leaders of those groups that had previously threatened to leave have said, well, we don't like this plan either. So I took up your time before lunch to tell you about the plan because people want to know about the plan, but it really has no political future at General Conference, in my personal opinion. Oh, by the way, central conferences could opt to be part of a branch if they want, or they could just keep their own thing the way it is today. So again, that global contextualization, central conferences will make their decision to do this or just stay the way they are. Let's go to the next slide. So the other thing that we have talked about is this traditionalist model. And remember when I said this one answer wasn't working for us? And the bishops said, look for contextual differentiation, find some place in the middle? Those two plans I've just described are really the work of the commission. That one church model, creating space through better compatibility, that is our recommendation, overwhelmingly from the commission. That is the recommendation from the Council of Bishops, overwhelmingly. You'll get more details when the reports come out, and you can have your own adjective. But the only plan that got a majority of the commission and a majority of the bishops is that one church model. The multi-branch model, the connectional conference model, that is our work as the commission, because we tried really hard to find, could we do some option that had structural space for the reasons I described. That is our work, and the bishops wanted to share all of our work with the general church, so We describe it in our report, and the petitions to implement it are there in our report. We also, in our conversation back and forth with bishops, talked about the traditional plan. We talked about the current rules and where did the most conservative element of the church seem to want to take us there in order to enforce those rules. So we had that conversation back and forth. There's a small bit of our report that describes what we did and didn't do on that. And then in the appendix of the report, there's a longer description of one possible implementation of a traditionalist plan. Not strictly speaking our work, it's part of the things we discussed, but other people worked on that. And that's this traditional plan where we're going to make the rules more enforced. So next slide. So the rules would get tightened, the definition of what a self-avowed practicing homosexual is, and I apologize to the gay folks in the room for using those terms that are in our book of discipline, but the definition, what does that mean? How do you catch somebody? There are a few more things. We have a judicial process that would be altered specifically for disagreements around this question, because it seems like in some places where if disobedience is happening and the bishop is willing to enforce it, but the clergy in that area don't support it, they have trouble getting convictions even through the process. So we would tighten up that, and we would tighten up the penalties. So in your first offense of doing a wedding that you weren't supposed to do, the penalty is X, and the second offense, you lose your credential. So minimum penalties, and there's some more rights in there about how complainants can maintain their rights through the process and their influence through the process, whether the church can appeal something that looks like jury nullification. That's a civil term. I don't think it shows up in our petition, but that's basically what that's working on, tightening up the rules in our jurisprudence. And there would be, in this process, also some fun votes, because either you're in or you're out with respect to the rules. So the annual conference would need to have a vote. Does the annual conference agree to uphold the rules or not? And if the answer is no, they will be invited to leave the United Methodist Church, start a new denomination, and invited for that denomination to be in relationship with the remaining United Methodist Church through concordant agreements, shared use of certain agencies, and clergy exchange and things like that. So the annual conference would try to certify or not. The bishops would need to do the same thing, because they're the ones that many people think are not enforcing the rules. And even in terms of ordination, the bishops appoint people to the Board of Ordained Ministry, so of course we need to make sure that the Board of Ordained Ministry new people are upholding those rules. So to be sure that the bishops are doing what they had just promised to do, there's some aspects there. You'll need to see the details for this to make sense to you. And then if you don't fit anymore, then we offer a gracious exit. So the progressive annual conferences are kind of pushed out graciously to this new denomination, and if a local church wants to leave, local church can leave graciously into that new whatever that is. If your annual conference got pushed out, but you didn't want to leave and you wanted to stay as a church, you could vote and be back in. So that's the idea of creating a new progressive denomination that would be in relationship with us in the United Methodist Church even after that split through concordat, which means a few people come to general conference and all that. Also in this plan, it would let other groups of people leave. So because some people feel like, well, this is going to be a big mess and it's going to be a prolonged period of conflict. Some churches are going to just want to leave, and you've seen some churches already leave because they don't want to be around the conflict. This would let a group of 50 or more churches that, not because they want to be progressive, but because of other reasons, they could start their own thing. They could create a self-governing Methodist church, and they could be invited back into relationship with the Methodist Church. And there's not really a limit on what that would be. But many people had looked for some way of exiting the church, and so this gives them a couple ways. That's the traditional plan with increased enforcement. And if we could just go to the next slide. We have only 3 days of business in St. Louis. We have just 3 days. It's not a typical general conference. The number of topics is much shorter. It's just this one topic, but we only have 3 days, and some of these plans are quite complicated. The one church plan that the bishops and the commission have recommended is the simplest plan. It's a pretty simple plan. We could do that in 3 days. The Connectional conference plan that a minority had supported and the traditional plan that a minority had supported, they are both far more complicated. So one of the things that the church will be discerning between now and February, after the full details are out and before we get to St. Louis, is where do we want to go? And we really need to think hard about that, and the delegates will need to think hard about that and come prepared when we get to St. Louis to figure out which direction we're going to go, because it's a short period of time. And I think basically the main competition, if you will, from a political perspective, is that the one church plan will be represented as the recommendation of the bishops and the commission, supported by groups like the Uniting Methodist movement, and we'll be framing this as a pro-unity plan that avoids schism. And we know that some people have left before and some more people will be leaving, but we will not be endorsing schism. We won't be saying, here's how you go create a new thing. We will be saying, we can all stay together. Your conscience is protected. There is no coercion towards pastors, so we can all stay together. That is a pro-unity, anti-schism plan. And then the traditional plan, some of the folks from conservative caucuses have announced that they plan to either support what's in the commission's report or create their own version of a traditional plan, and they will be pushing that at General Conference. I would say that their argument they would be saying their argument is pro-Bible, based on biblical authority. Obviously, there's a biblical argument for other things, but that is what they're primarily lead with. It feels kind of anti-homosexual to the LGBT community, and they will not articulate it that way, but it's in that bucket. And whatever passes at General Conference will come down to whether the international church sees that our future as a global church means we need to have a little bit more regional autonomy. Right? Remember, they have the ability to adapt the Book of Discipline in some places, and there's a major effort underway in the general church working on additional changes to that adaptability of the global church. We know those are coming in 2020. It might take a couple of general conferences to get there, but it would seem that as we are increasingly an international body, there's a need to respond with more flexibility regionally. Those things are kind of coming down on a path. This controversy is not waiting. So we'll be asking the international delegates to kind of see where we need to be internationally to be able to stay in relationship. So this is going to be about our global connection in many respects. And realize, well, the majority of the American delegates are thinking that one church plan makes sense, as did the bishops and the commission. Let's let America have that ability to contextualize within America, because we all will need the ability to contextualize regionally. Buying that argument by a certain number of international delegates will determine the outcome of St. Louis. So that's what I had to say about the plan.